On a warm September night in 2004, 20-year-old Lena Whitcomb vanished without a trace. That evening began like any other for Lena. She had just finished a long shift at a local diner in a quiet Texas town, a place where life moved slowly and everyone knew one another by name. Lena was known for her bright smile and her kind heart. She had dreams bigger than the dusty streets she grew up on, dreams of leaving town to study nursing and one day building a better life for herself and her family. Her parents, Harold and Margaret, adored her deeply. She was their youngest, their baby girl, and the bond they shared was unbreakable. That night, Harold waited up in his recliner, expecting to hear Lena's footsteps on the porch. But those footsteps never came. The next morning, the sun rose over the small town, and with it came a nightmare that no one could have ever imagined. Lena's pickup truck was found abandoned near a lonely stretch of back road, just a few miles from the diner where she worked. Its headlights were still faintly glowing in the early morning light. The driver's side door hung wide open, as if she had left in a rush. Inside, her purse sat untouched on the seat. Nothing appeared to have been taken, but the most unsettling detail of all were her shoes, neatly placed side by side on the ground beside the truck. It was as though Lena had calmly taken them off before disappearing into the darkness. That single image, the truck, the shoes, the empty road, would haunt investigators, her family, and the entire community for decades to come. From that moment forward, fear swept through the town like a cold wind. People began locking their doors at night. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors, once friendly and trusting, began looking at one another with suspicion. For 20 years, this mystery lingered like a shadow over the community. The question everyone asked was simple, but devastating. What happened to Lena Whitcomb? At first, there were countless theories. Some believed it was the work of a stranger passing through town. Others thought Lena might have run away, though anyone who truly knew her said she would never leave without saying goodbye to her family. And then there were those who suspected someone closer to home, someone she trusted, someone who might have been hiding in plain sight all along. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to stall. The initial search efforts were massive. Volunteers combed through fields, creeks, and abandoned buildings. Law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly, knocking on doors and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. But no matter how hard they tried, no solid leads emerged. Each day that passed without answers only deepened the pain for Lena's loved ones. Harold and Margaret refused to give up. They spent sleepless nights printing missing person flyers, hanging them on telephone poles, and driving across neighboring towns in desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen their daughter. The media soon picked up the story, and for a brief moment, Lena's case captured statewide attention. News anchors spoke of her disappearance, showing pictures of her smiling face alongside images of the eerie crime scene. But as is often the case, public interest faded as other stories emerged, and the Whitcomb family was left to face their grief alone. It was during these quiet, agonizing years that Lena's parents began to feel the crushing weight of hopelessness. For Harold, life became a series of painful routines. He would wake up each morning, sit by the kitchen table, and stare at the empty chair where Lena once sat. Margaret turned to faith, attending church every Sunday, praying for a miracle. But behind closed doors, the couple's grief was relentless. Their marriage strained under the pressure, yet they held on to each other, determined to keep Lena's memory alive. In 2005, a year after Lena's disappearance, investigators stumbled upon a potential lead. A piece of fabric was discovered near a wooded area not far from where her truck had been found. Initially, hopes soared, but when forensic testing came back inconclusive, the evidence was shelved, and once again, the trail went cold. This pattern of hope followed by disappointment became all too familiar over the years. Every phone call from the sheriff's department sent Harold and Margaret's hearts racing, only to end with more questions than answers. As the years stretched on, the case became what many called a ghost file. It sat in a cabinet gathering dust, until a new team of detectives decided to take another look. By 2019, technology had advanced in ways investigators from 2004 could never have imagined. DNA testing was now more precise, and digital forensics could uncover hidden connections once thought impossible to trace. That year, Texas launched a specialized cold case task force dedicated to solving decades-old crimes. Lena's case was one of the first to be reviewed. When detectives reopened the file, they immediately noticed troubling gaps in the original investigation. Witness statements had been overlooked, pieces of evidence had been improperly catalogued, and most importantly, there were individuals in Lena's life who had never been fully questioned. The new lead investigator, a determined detective named Mark Dalton, was struck by one detail in particular: the placement of Lena's shoes. "People don't just take their shoes off and vanish into the night," he later said. This seemingly small detail sparked a renewed focus on the crime scene. With fresh eyes, Dalton and his team began reconstructing Lena's final moments step by step. In 2021, the team received a break they never expected. During a drought, water levels in the creek dropped dramatically, revealing areas that had been hidden for years. While conducting a thorough search, investigators discovered an old piece of duct tape partially buried in the mud. The tape appeared ordinary, but forensic testing revealed something extraordinary: Lena's DNA, alongside the DNA of another person. This finding was monumental. With advanced technology, analysts were able to match the unknown DNA to someone still living in the very same town, someone Lena had known well. Suddenly, the investigation shifted from a cold case to an active homicide inquiry. As detectives dug deeper, a disturbing picture began to form. Through phone records, financial transactions, and newly recovered witness statements, they pieced together a timeline that pointed to one man, Aaron Kellerman, Lena's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Back in 2004, Aaron had been interviewed and cleared due to lack of evidence. His alibi seemed solid, and there was no proof connecting him to the scene. But 20 years later, that alibi began to unravel under scrutiny. It turned out that on the night Lena vanished, Aaron's cell phone pinged near the very location where her truck was found, something investigators in 2004 didn't have the technology to track accurately. In addition, a receipt surfaced showing Aaron had purchased industrial-strength cleaning supplies just days after Lena went missing. But the most damning discovery came in 2023, when Aaron's old storage unit was searched under a new warrant. Inside, detectives found a small notebook hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. The entries in that notebook were chilling. One page read, "Night of 14, no traces left." Another said, "They'll never find her." These cryptic notes, combined with the physical evidence, painted a horrifying picture of what had happened to Lena. As the case built momentum, the town watched in stunned silence. Many had known Aaron for years. He wasn't an outsider, he was one of their own. When the arrest finally came in July 2024, it sent shockwaves through the community. People who once defended Aaron were now grappling with the possibility that he had been living among them all this time, carrying the weight of a terrible secret. The trial was one of the most highly publicized events the town had ever seen. Over several weeks, prosecutors laid out their case, presenting the DNA evidence, the notebook, and a series of testimonies that revealed Aaron's controlling behavior and escalating arguments with Lena in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Witness after witness painted a picture of a relationship that had turned toxic, with Lena attempting to break free from Aaron's grip. During the trial, Lena's parents sat in the front row every single day, clutching each other's hands as they listened to the horrifying details of their daughter's final moments. When the guilty verdict was finally read, there was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Aaron was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Harold and Margaret, it was a bitter-sweet victory. They finally had answers, but those answers came at a tremendous emotional cost. "Justice was served," Margaret later said, tears streaming down her face. "But it will never bring our Lena back." Stay with me until the end of this video, because there's one final revelation a piece of information that came to light after the trial that changes everything you think you know about this case. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. As we unravel this story, 3 haunting questions linger, questions that have consumed this small Texas town for 20 long, agonizing years. These questions have kept families awake at night, caused bitter divisions among neighbors, and haunted Lena Whitcomb's loved ones every single day since the night she vanished. The first question is the one that has tormented everyone the most. Who was truly responsible for Lena's disappearance? From the moment her truck was found abandoned near that desolate creek bed, speculation erupted. At first, some believed this was the work of a stranger passing through, a dangerous drifter perhaps, who saw an opportunity and took it. That theory terrified the entire town because it meant Lena's disappearance could have been random, that no one was truly safe, and that her killer might have slipped away into the night, leaving nothing behind but fear. But others were convinced the truth was much closer to home. Lena was deeply rooted in this community. She worked at the local diner, she went to church with her parents every Sunday, she had close friends and a boyfriend she was deeply involved with. Could the person responsible for her disappearance have been someone within that circle? Someone she trusted? Someone who knew her well enough to lure her out there that night without a struggle? That possibility was even more frightening because it meant that, for years, the people desperately searching for Lena may have been unknowingly standing shoulder to shoulder with her killer. It meant the person responsible could have been sitting quietly at community events, blending in, all while hiding a terrible secret. The second question is one that carries its own weight of anger and frustration. Why did it take 20 years to solve this case? In those early days back in September of 2004, the response to Lena's disappearance was immediate. Search parties flooded the area. Volunteers combed through fields and wooded areas, while helicopters searched from above. Law enforcement from multiple neighboring counties joined in. For a brief period, it felt as though the entire town had united for one goal: to bring Lena home. But within that chaos, crucial mistakes were made. Evidence wasn't handled with the care it needed. Key witnesses weren't thoroughly interviewed. Certain areas were overlooked entirely. As the weeks passed without progress, the initial urgency began to fade. People returned to their routines, tips slowed down, and eventually, the case lost momentum. For a small-town sheriff's department with limited resources, the investigation was overwhelming. As newer cases came in, Lena's file was gradually pushed aside. Leads went cold. Over time, her case became what many call a ghost file, a case that sits untouched, quietly gathering dust while families wait for answers that may never come. But some believe the delays weren't just about lack of resources. Some believe there were people, either knowingly or unknowingly, who allowed the truth to slip through their fingers. Whether it was incompetence, fear, or even deliberate deception, Lena's family has always wondered if someone in power failed them in the worst possible way. And then there is the third and most painful question of all. When the truth finally came out, why did it leave even Lena's family questioning everything they thought they knew? For 20 years, Harold and Margaret Whitcomb lived with a fixed image of their daughter. To them, Lena was forever the bright, hopeful young woman who dreamed of becoming a nurse, who loved her family, and who had been the innocent victim of a cruel and random act of violence. But as the investigation was reopened in 2019 and new evidence came to light, it revealed pieces of Lena's life they had never known. Secrets she had kept, choices she had made in the days leading up to her disappearance, that painted a much more complicated picture of who she was and what might have truly happened that night. By the time the case went to trial in 2024, Lena's parents were no longer simply grieving the loss of their daughter. They were grappling with revelations that forced them to question everything: her relationships, her last known actions, even their own memories of her final days. The answers that finally emerged would not only solve the case, but also leave Harold and Margaret forever changed. What they learned inside that courtroom would bring them both closure and heartbreak. For 20 years, these three questions held the entire town hostage. Who was responsible for Lena's disappearance? Why did it take so long to uncover the truth? And when the final revelation came, why did it shake even those closest to Lena to their core? As you listen to this story, these are the questions that will guide us. And with each step, as we move deeper into the events of that night, you'll begin to see how one single mistake in the early hours of this case set off a chain reaction that delayed justice for 2 decades. You'll see how new technology and sheer determination finally broke through the silence and lies. And ultimately, you'll hear the shocking revelation that left everyone, even Lena's own family, stunned into silence. Stay with me until the very end of this video, because the truth behind these questions is far more shocking than anyone could have ever imagined. Lena Whitcomb was born in the summer of 1984, the youngest of 3 children in a family that valued hard work, faith, and community. Her parents, Harold and Margaret Whitcomb, raised their family in a modest home on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. It wasn't a place of wealth or privilege, but it was a home filled with love, tradition, and a sense of belonging. Growing up, Lena was surrounded by the quiet rhythms of small-town life. Early mornings spent helping her mother in the kitchen, afternoons playing with friends in open fields, and Sundays reserved for church and family dinners. Everyone in town knew the Whitcombs, and everyone seemed to know Lena, the bright-spirited youngest child who had a way of making people feel seen and heard. From a young age, Lena displayed a deep sense of empathy. Teachers at her elementary school described her as the kind of child who would comfort a classmate who was crying or give up her own lunch if someone forgot theirs. By the time she reached high school, this compassion had grown into a clear ambition. Lena dreamed of becoming a nurse. She wanted to dedicate her life to helping others, to making a difference in a world she knew could be cruel and unpredictable. Friends later recalled how she'd stay up late poring over medical textbooks, her notebooks filled with handwritten goals about scholarships and training programs. Lena was also fiercely independent. While she was close to her parents and siblings, she longed to build a life of her own. She worked tirelessly at the local diner to save up for nursing school, juggling late-night shifts with her studies. Regular customers remembered her for her warm smile and attentive nature, always quick to ask about their families or offer a kind word after a hard day. It was this combination of ambition and kindness that made Lena beloved by nearly everyone she met. But like many young adults, Lena's life wasn't without complications. As she transitioned from high school into adulthood, she found herself navigating relationships, responsibilities, and the pressure of making her own way in the world. Around this time, she began dating a local man named Daniel Harper. To those on the outside, their relationship appeared typical, even happy. Daniel was charming, with a steady job at a nearby auto shop, and he often spoke of wanting to build a future with Lena. They were frequently seen together at church picnics and football games, their hands intertwined, sharing quiet moments that seemed to hint at a lasting love. However, close friends began to notice subtle cracks beneath the surface. Lena, who had always been outgoing and full of energy, occasionally seemed withdrawn after being with Daniel. There were whispers of arguments, of disagreements about Lena's plans to attend nursing school in another city. Some friends described moments when Daniel's behavior seemed controlling, comments about who Lena spent time with or subtle criticisms that chipped away at her confidence. Lena rarely spoke openly about these tensions, often brushing off concerns with a quick smile or a dismissive laugh, but those closest to her sensed there was more to the story than she was letting on. At the same time, there were tensions within the town itself. In 2004, Austin's surrounding areas were growing rapidly, with new developments creeping into what had once been quiet farmland. Longtime residents often clashed with newcomers over everything from land use to cultural changes. For families like the Whitcombs, who had deep roots in the area, this shift created a sense of unease. Harold, Lena's father, worked tirelessly to maintain the family's small plot of land, while Margaret devoted herself to the church and community activities. They had always trusted that their town was a safe place to raise children, a place where neighbors looked out for one another. But beneath that surface of familiarity and safety, there were darker currents. Crime rates were creeping upward, and there were stories, rare but unsettling, of young women being followed at night or harassed near the highways that cut through the region. Lena, always practical and cautious, was aware of these risks, and she often reassured her mother that she was careful when driving home late from work. Still, Margaret couldn't shake a quiet, persistent worry that something could happen to her daughter, especially as Lena's work schedule required her to travel along isolated back roads late at night. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Lena seemed particularly stressed. She had been working extra shifts at the diner, trying to save every penny for nursing school, and her relationship with Daniel appeared more strained than ever. Friends recalled conversations where Lena expressed doubts about their future, even hinting that she might end things so she could focus on her studies. These comments, while casual at the time, would later take on a chilling significance when viewed through the lens of everything that happened next. Despite the undercurrents of tension, Lena remained deeply loved and admired. On the evening of September 14, 2004, she finished her shift at the diner, said goodbye to her co-workers with her usual warmth, and promised her mother she'd be home shortly. It was a routine evening, nothing out of the ordinary. No one could have predicted that within hours Lena would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a trail of questions and heartbreak that would span 2 decades. Lena's story is not just about the night she disappeared. It's about the young woman she was, the daughter, the sister, the friend whose laughter once filled rooms and whose dreams were just beginning to take shape. It's about a family whose lives were forever changed, and a community that would spend 20 years grappling with the loss of one of their own. And as we look closer at Lena's life, it becomes clear that the seeds of this tragedy were planted long before that September night. There were moments, subtle and easily overlooked, that hinted at the storm to come. A strained conversation, a quiet tear, a plan postponed or abandoned. Each of these moments, small on their own, would ultimately form the foundation of a mystery that baffled investigators and tore a family apart. To understand the disappearance of Lena Whitcomb, we must first understand who she was, what she loved, and what she feared. Because the key to solving this case lies not just in evidence and timelines, but in the heart of a young woman whose life was cut short before she ever had the chance to fully live it. As we move forward, keep Lena at the center of your mind. Remember her laughter, her ambition, and her determination. Because in the end, justice isn't just about finding a perpetrator, it's about honoring the life that was taken and uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it may be. The night of September 14, 2004, began like so many others for the Whitcomb family. Lena had worked a long shift at the local diner, staying late to help cover for a co-worker who had called in sick. It wasn't unusual. Lena had always been dependable, always willing to pick up extra hours if it meant saving a little more money for her dream of nursing school. That evening, she moved gracefully between tables, greeting the regulars with her signature warm smile, filling coffee cups, and chatting about the upcoming high school football game. To everyone who saw her that night, Lena seemed perfectly normal. She laughed with her co-workers, even joking with the cook about how exhausted she felt. It was a typical Tuesday in a small Texas town. Ordinary, uneventful. But ordinary nights can sometimes hide extraordinary darkness. At 9:28 p.m., the surveillance camera near the back door of the diner captured Lena as she clocked out for the night. The footage is grainy, but her face is unmistakable, tired yet cheerful. She waves to someone off camera, slings her purse over her shoulder, and walks out into the cool September night. She clocked out, just like any other night, but she never made it home. Lena's usual drive home took roughly 15 minutes, winding through quiet back roads lined with fields and patches of dense woodland. It was a route she'd traveled countless times, familiar and routine. But on this particular night, something went terribly wrong. Around 10 o'clock, Margaret Whitcomb, Lena's mother, began to grow concerned. Lena was almost always home by then, and she had promised to stop by the kitchen for a late-night snack before heading to bed. At first, Margaret tried to dismiss her worry. Maybe Lena had decided to stop for gas. Maybe she'd run into a friend and was chatting in a parking lot. But as the minutes ticked by, unease began to creep in. Margaret called Lena's phone. No answer. She tried again. Straight to voicemail. Harold, Lena's father, told Margaret not to panic. Lena was a responsible young woman, and there was probably a simple explanation. But deep down, Margaret felt something was wrong. She described it later as a mother's intuition, the kind of dread you can't explain. By 10:45 p.m., Margaret's worry turned to outright fear. She began calling Lena's friends, asking if anyone had seen her. One by one, the answers came back the same. No, they hadn't heard from her since she left work. By 11:15 p.m., Harold grabbed his truck keys and told Margaret they were going to retrace Lena's route. It wasn't like their daughter to be out of contact. The quiet Texas roads stretched endlessly under the glow of the moon as they drove, calling her name, scanning the ditches and fields with flashlights. A few friends, alerted by Margaret's calls, joined the search. They drove slowly, every pair of headlights cutting through the dark, desperately looking for any sign of Lena. Then, at 11:42 p.m., one of the searchers spotted something. Up ahead, just off a narrow dirt road near a small rural creek, sat Lena's blue Ford pickup truck. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Margaret's heart sank. Harold slammed the truck into park and jumped out, yelling Lena's name into the night. There was no answer, only the low hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. Inside the truck, Lena's purse sat untouched on the passenger seat, her wallet and phone still inside. The keys were in the ignition. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. And then they saw it. On the ground, just a few feet away from the open door, lay a single blood-stained scarf. The scarf was one Lena often wore to work, a delicate floral pattern Margaret had given her as a gift. Now, it was smeared with a dark, chilling stain that confirmed what everyone feared. Something terrible had happened. Margaret dropped to her knees, sobbing, while Harold scanned the surrounding woods, his voice breaking as he shouted for his daughter. From that moment on, the search for Lena became a race against time. Whoever had been with her that night was out there, somewhere, and every second that passed felt like a lifetime. By midnight, the rural road was flooded with police vehicles, their flashing red and blue lights casting eerie shadows through the trees. Investigators quickly roped off the area, collecting the scarf and dusting the truck for fingerprints. The scene was haunting. There were no tire tracks other than Lena's, no signs of a struggle, just that open door, the abandoned purse, and the scarf. It was as if Lena had stepped out of the truck and disappeared into thin air. Officers scoured the surrounding area, searching the creek, the fields, and the nearby woods with flashlights and dogs, but there was no trace of Lena, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing. By dawn, the case had shifted from a missing person search to something far more terrifying. The Whitcomb family was devastated. Margaret clung to the hope that Lena was still alive, that she might somehow be out there, scared but safe. Harold, though quiet and stoic, admitted later that when he saw the blood on that scarf, he knew deep down that something irreversible had happened. Lena's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy for her family. It was a rupture in the very fabric of the community. Everyone knew Lena. Everyone loved her. And now, someone out there had taken her and left no trace. As investigators worked the scene, rumors began to swirl. Some whispered about dangerous strangers passing through town. Others suggested someone local might be responsible, someone who knew Lena's habits, her route home, the exact moment she'd be alone on that road. But one thing was certain. The truth of what happened to Lena Whitcomb that night was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. And the blood-stained scarf? It was just the beginning. In the days immediately following Lena's disappearance, the quiet Texas town she called home was transformed into a hive of activity. Word spread quickly, and by the following morning, hundreds of residents had gathered to help. Volunteers formed search parties, combing through fields, riverbanks, and dense patches of woodland. They waded through muddy creeks, pushed through thorny brush, and scoured every abandoned shed and barn for any sign of Lena. For weeks, hope remained alive. Lena's smiling face stared back from hundreds of posters taped to streetlights, pinned to corkboards in local diners, and plastered across shop windows. Her parents, Harold and Margaret, refused to let despair take over. They spoke to every news crew that came through town, pleading with anyone who might know something, anything, to come forward. Candlelight vigils were held on the steps of the local courthouse. Entire families came out, holding flickering candles and singing hymns, while Lena's picture was projected on a makeshift screen behind them. Local churches organized prayer circles. Restaurants donated food and coffee to the search teams. For a while, it seemed like the entire community was united by one shared purpose: finding Lena and bringing her home. But as the days turned to weeks, a sense of unease began to creep in. Despite the massive search efforts, not a single trace of Lena was found beyond the blood-stained scarf. Search dogs came up empty. Divers scoured the creek and surrounding waterways, but there was nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign of a body. It was as though Lena had been swallowed whole by the night. As frustration mounted, law enforcement began to focus their attention closer to home. And it wasn't long before suspicion fell squarely on one man: Lena's boyfriend, Aaron Kellerman. Aaron and Lena had been dating for almost a year. By all outward appearances, they were a happy couple, but as investigators started digging deeper, cracks in the picture-perfect relationship began to emerge. Witnesses came forward to report that just days before Lena vanished, they had overheard the couple arguing loudly outside the diner where she worked. One of Lena's co-workers recalled seeing her with red, puffy eyes the next day, as though she'd been crying. Aaron was brought in for questioning. Under the harsh glare of the interrogation room lights, he admitted they'd had disagreements, but he insisted they were nothing serious, just the typical ups and downs of young love. He told detectives that on the night Lena disappeared, he was at home alone, watching television. The problem was, no one could confirm his alibi. Rumors swirled around town. Some whispered that Aaron had a jealous streak, that he didn't like Lena working late nights or spending time with her friends. Others claimed they'd seen bruises on Lena's arms weeks before she vanished, though none of this could be substantiated. The circumstantial evidence seemed to paint a troubling picture, but when it came down to cold, hard facts, the case against Aaron was frustratingly thin. There were no fingerprints in Lena's truck that didn't belong there, no blood in his home or vehicle, no witness who had actually seen him with Lena that night. Without a body, without physical evidence, the district attorney's office couldn't move forward. Aaron was released, and though he remained a person of interest, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. This decision divided the town. Some believed Aaron was guilty, and that he had somehow outsmarted investigators, hiding Lena's body in a place no one would ever find. Others believed he was innocent, a young man unfairly vilified while the real culprit walked free. Meanwhile, Lena's family was trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty. Margaret described it as living in a house full of ghosts. Lena's room was left untouched, her clothes neatly folded in the drawers, her nursing school textbooks stacked on her desk. Every time the phone rang, Margaret's heart would leap, hoping it was Lena calling to say she was safe. But the calls that did come were never from Lena. They were from strangers claiming to have seen her in nearby towns, from psychics offering their services, or from anonymous individuals providing vague, unverified tips that always led nowhere. As weeks turned to months, the vigils grew smaller. The posters began to fade and tear in the wind. Search parties dwindled, exhausted both physically and emotionally. The case was slowly slipping away. By the one-year anniversary of Lena's disappearance, investigators had little to show for their efforts. The file on Lena's case was thick with interviews, reports, and dead-end leads, but not a single piece of evidence that could definitively point to a suspect. Hope began to wither. Then, in the fall of 2006, a small glimmer of progress appeared. A hunter reported finding what he believed to be a piece of torn fabric deep in the woods near the county line, about 10 miles from where Lena's truck had been discovered. When investigators arrived, they realized it was the same floral pattern as Lena's scarf, the one found at the scene 2 years earlier. Nearby, they discovered what appeared to be faint drag marks in the dirt, partially obscured by years of weather and wildlife. But this promising lead soon dissolved into yet another disappointment. The fabric was too degraded to test for DNA, and the drag marks were too old to be conclusive. Without further evidence, the discovery did little more than fuel speculation. As the years passed, the investigation grew colder. Detectives were reassigned to new cases, leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or passed on. The once intense media coverage dwindled to the occasional article or anniversary mention on local news. For the Whitcomb family, the passage of time was agonizing. Margaret clung to the belief that Lena was still alive somewhere. Harold, on the other hand, began to quietly prepare himself for the possibility that they might never see their daughter again. But what no one knew, not the family, not the townspeople, not even the investigators, was that the key to solving Lena's case had been hiding in plain sight all along. It would take nearly 20 years, a new generation of detectives, and a single unexpected breakthrough to finally bring the truth to light. And when that truth emerged, it wouldn't just solve a mystery. It would destroy everything they thought they knew. As the years slipped by, Lena's disappearance became a painful wound that never healed, both for her family and for the town itself. For many in the community, Lena's face had become a haunting reminder of unanswered questions, of a night that shattered the illusion of safety they had once taken for granted. But for Harold and Margaret Whitcomb, it was something much deeper. Their daughter's absence was a daily torment. Every morning, Margaret would wake up and walk past Lena's room, pausing at the doorway, half expecting to see her lying there, asleep and safe. Every evening, Harold would sit silently at the dinner table, staring at the empty chair across from him, his mind filled with memories of family dinners when laughter used to fill the house. While the official investigation stalled, the Whitcombs refused to let their daughter's memory fade. Margaret, who had never been particularly tech-savvy, learned how to use social media. She created a Facebook page dedicated to finding Lena, sharing old photographs, timelines of her last known movements, and pleas for information. At first, the page only attracted a small circle of friends and family, but over time, it grew, drawing the attention of true crime enthusiasts, journalists, and other families of missing persons. Harold, on the other hand, became the public face of their advocacy. He traveled across Texas, attending rallies for missing persons, speaking at community events, and lobbying lawmakers to increase funding for cold case units. He wrote letters to police chiefs, district attorneys, and even state senators, begging them to revisit Lena's case. For a while, it felt like shouting into the void. Many officials offered polite words of sympathy, but no real action. Detectives, stretched thin by newer cases, would occasionally return Harold's calls, only to give him the same answer they had been giving for years. "We're doing everything we can." The emotional toll was devastating. Margaret's health began to decline. Years of stress and grief etched deep lines into her face. She developed insomnia, often staying up all night scrolling through online forums, reading about other missing person cases, wondering if one of those stories might hold a clue to Lena's fate. Harold grew more withdrawn, his once booming laugh replaced by long, heavy silences. Lena's siblings were caught in the middle. Her older sister, Rachel, moved out of state, unable to bear the constant reminders of her sister's absence. Her brother, Mark, stayed close to home, trying to support his parents while struggling with his own anger and guilt. In quiet moments, he would admit to friends that he blamed himself for not being there to protect Lena the night she vanished. Despite the pain, the Whitcombs never gave up. Every year on the anniversary of Lena's disappearance, they held a vigil at the creek where her truck had been found. Dozens of people would gather, holding candles as Harold spoke about his daughter's life, her dreams, and the hope that one day they would find answers. But as the 15-year mark approached, that hope was growing dangerously thin. Leads had dried up completely. Many of the original investigators had retired or moved on. The boxes containing Lena's case files sat untouched in a dusty evidence room, slowly fading into obscurity. And then, in 2019, everything changed. That year, the Texas Department of Public Safety announced the creation of a specialized cold case task force, a team dedicated to revisiting old, unsolved crimes with fresh eyes and advanced forensic technology. Harold, who had been following every development in missing persons advocacy, immediately contacted the task force. He pleaded with them to take on Lena's case, sending them copies of every letter, photograph, and document he had collected over the years. To his surprise, they agreed. A new team of investigators was assigned to the case, led by Detective Emily Vargas, a seasoned officer known for her meticulous attention to detail. From the very beginning, Vargas approached the case differently. She didn't just review the old files, she rebuilt the investigation from the ground up. The first step was re-examining every piece of physical evidence. Advances in DNA technology since 2004 had been staggering. Items that had once been considered useless were now potential goldmines of information. Lena's scarf, the one found blood-stained near her truck, was retested. The truck itself, long since returned to the family, was temporarily seized for a thorough forensic sweep, using equipment that hadn't existed back when it was first examined. But it wasn't just technology that gave the task force an edge, it was perspective. Detective Vargas and her team didn't have the same biases or assumptions as the original investigators. They weren't weighed down by years of frustration or community pressure. They approached every theory with fresh eyes and open minds. One of their first discoveries was a series of inconsistencies in the original witness statements. Several people who had been interviewed in 2004 gave slightly different accounts when re-questioned in 2019. These discrepancies, while subtle, hinted at the possibility that someone had been withholding information or lying outright. Meanwhile, Margaret and Harold were cautiously optimistic. After so many years of disappointment, they had learned not to get their hopes up too high. But when Detective Vargas personally visited their home to update them on the progress, they felt something they hadn't felt in years: genuine hope. Margaret recalled later that Vargas had looked her directly in the eye and said, "We're going to find out what happened to Lena. I can't promise when, but I can promise that we won't stop until we do." For the first time in nearly 2 decades, it felt like someone was truly listening. Over the next several months, the task force methodically reviewed every lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They re-interviewed old witnesses, tracked down former suspects, and scoured the surrounding area for evidence that might have been missed the first time around. And then came the breakthrough. While combing through the original case files, a young analyst on Vargas's team noticed something strange. Among the evidence logged back in 2004 was a small piece of duct tape found near the creek. At the time, it had been dismissed as unrelated trash, but when re-examined under modern testing methods, it revealed something shocking: trace amounts of Lena's blood and the DNA of an unknown male. This single discovery reignited the entire investigation. Detective Vargas ordered a full DNA profile to be created and run through the national database. Weeks later, a match came back. The DNA belonged to someone in the town, a person who had been interviewed back in 2004 but never considered a serious suspect. When the name was revealed, it sent shockwaves through the task force. It wasn't Aaron Kellerman. It wasn't anyone who had been publicly connected to the case. It was someone entirely unexpected. For Harold and Margaret, the news was almost too much to process. After years of clinging to one narrative, that Aaron had harmed their daughter, they were now being told that the truth was far more complicated. The community braced itself for what would come next. The cold case that had haunted them for 2 decades was about to erupt back into the headlines, and the answers they had all been waiting for would change everything. In late 2019, after nearly 15 years of silence, the Texas Department of Public Safety's newly formed Cold Case Task Force officially reopened Lena Whitcomb's case. For Harold and Margaret, it was a moment they had been fighting for since the night their daughter disappeared, a glimmer of hope breaking through years of despair. The Cold Case team brought with them cutting-edge technology that simply hadn't existed back in 2004. What had once been limitations were now opportunities. Detective Emily Vargas, leading the task force, understood the weight of the case. She knew that for Lena's family this wasn't just another file, it was their entire world hanging in the balance. The first step was to go back to square one. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, was pulled from storage and carefully catalogued again. Dusty boxes of files were reopened, photographs were re-examined under digital enhancement, and long-forgotten witness statements were reviewed with a fresh perspective. But it wasn't until they revisited the crime scene itself that things began to shift. On a chilly November morning, the team returned to the rural creek where Lena's truck had been found. Armed with ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution drones, and portable DNA scanners, they meticulously combed through the area. It had been almost 15 years since Lena vanished, and nature had long since reclaimed the site. But Vargas and her team were relentless. Hours into the search, a young forensic analyst spotted something unusual beneath a layer of compacted soil and leaves, a small, weathered fragment of duct tape. At first it didn't seem significant. Pieces of trash were common in rural areas, and the original investigators had collected similar items before dismissing them. But this time, with modern tools, things would be different. Back at the lab, the duct tape was carefully analyzed. Under the microscope, technicians discovered something chilling: tiny, nearly invisible traces of blood embedded in the adhesive. When tested, the blood matched Lena's DNA. But that wasn't the most shocking part. A secondary test revealed a partial male DNA profile on the same fragment. The lab ran the sample through the national database, and within days, they had a match. The results stunned the entire team. The DNA belonged to none other than Aaron Kellerman, Lena's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Detective Vargas now had hard forensic evidence placing Aaron at the scene. It was a turning point, a piece of evidence that connected him to Lena in a way that couldn't be explained by coincidence. But Vargas wasn't ready to stop there. She knew that in order to bring Aaron to justice, she would need an airtight case, something so compelling that even a skilled defense attorney couldn't tear it apart. The next step was digital forensics. Back in 2004, cell phone tracking technology was in its infancy. Records were limited, and law enforcement had only scratched the surface of what was possible. But now, with advancements in data retrieval, Vargas's team was able to access and interpret old records that had been considered useless at the time. They subpoenaed Aaron's old cell phone records and carefully mapped his movements on the night of Lena's disappearance. What they found was damning. The data placed Aaron near the creek between 9:45 p.m. and 10:15 p.m., the exact window when Lena would have been driving home from work. His phone had pinged multiple times in the area, before abruptly going dark for nearly an hour, only to resurface later that night several miles away. It was clear Aaron had been there. When confronted with this evidence during questioning, Aaron didn't flinch. He calmly told detectives that he had been driving around town, trying to clear his head after an argument with Lena earlier that evening. He claimed he had no idea what happened to her and insisted that he loved her and would never hurt her. Despite the mounting evidence, he maintained his innocence with a chilling composure. For Detective Vargas, it wasn't enough. She knew there was more to the story, something Aaron wasn't telling them. Digging deeper, the team began to analyze Aaron's digital footprint. They combed through old emails, text messages, and social media accounts. It was tedious work, but it eventually paid off. Buried deep in the archives of an old messaging platform, they uncovered a series of private conversations Aaron had deleted years earlier. In these messages, Aaron revealed a side of himself no one had ever seen, a possessive, controlling, and increasingly volatile young man. The messages painted a picture of a relationship spiraling out of control. Lena had been growing distant, talking about leaving town to pursue a nursing program in Dallas. Aaron, terrified of losing her, had become obsessed. He wrote about how he couldn't let her go, and in one chilling message, sent just 2 days before Lena vanished, he wrote, "If I can't have you, no one will." With this discovery, everything began to fall into place. The duct tape fragment, the cell phone data, the threatening messages. It all pointed to Aaron not just being involved, but being the central figure in Lena's disappearance. Still, Detective Vargas sensed there was something missing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece of the puzzle they hadn't uncovered yet, a secret Aaron was desperately trying to keep buried. Her instincts were proven right when a forensic accountant on the team unearthed an unexpected lead. While reviewing Aaron's financial records from 2004, they noticed several unusual cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to Lena's disappearance. The amounts were small enough to avoid suspicion, but the frequency was odd. Further investigation revealed that Aaron had been making payments to a local drifter with a history of petty crime and drug use, a man who had fled town shortly after Lena vanished. This revelation cracked the case wide open. Detectives began to suspect that Aaron hadn't acted alone. Perhaps he had lured Lena to the creek under the pretense of making amends, and when things escalated, this accomplice had helped him cover it up. The possibility of a second suspect added a whole new layer of urgency to the investigation. If Aaron had an accomplice, there was a chance this person could still be out there, ready to disappear again at any moment. With the net tightening, Vargas decided it was time to confront Aaron one final time. The interrogation room was silent as Aaron sat across from Vargas, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the duct tape, the cell phone records, the threatening messages, and finally the payments to the drifter. For the first time, Aaron's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted nervously. And then Vargas dropped the final bombshell. She revealed that investigators had tracked down the drifter. He was alive, and he had agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. According to his statement, Aaron had planned everything. Lena's death had not been an accident. It had been premeditated. In that moment, the last defense Aaron had been clinging to crumbled. His face went pale, and his voice trembled as he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." The room fell silent. After 15 long years, the truth had finally begun to emerge. But even as Aaron confessed to being at the creek that night, there were still unanswered questions, details about Lena's final moments that remained shrouded in mystery. For Harold and Margaret, those answers couldn't come soon enough. The cold case that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades was about to reach its shocking conclusion. Detective Vargas and her team thought they had finally unraveled the full scope of Aaron's lies. The duct tape, the threatening messages, the confession, they were enough to secure a conviction. But just when it seemed the case had reached its peak, a discovery was made that would turn everything upside down and expose a darkness no one had seen coming. During a final sweep of Aaron's old home, now abandoned and scheduled for demolition, investigators were searching through a crawl space beneath the floorboards when one of them noticed something wedged deep between 2 wooden beams. It was an old, weathered notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with Aaron's handwriting, dozens of entries stretching back years. At first it seemed like nothing more than the ramblings of a troubled young man. But as Detective Vargas carefully flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged. The entries weren't random. They were deliberate, calculated, and horrifyingly detailed. Near the back of the notebook they found the entry that froze everyone in the room. Written in bold, deliberate letters were the words, "Night of 14, no traces left." The next page was even more chilling. "They'll never find her." The room fell silent as Vargas read the words aloud. It wasn't just evidence. It was a confession, written long before Aaron had ever been arrested. These weren't the words of someone caught in a moment of rage. These were the words of a man who had meticulously planned every step of Lena's disappearance. But as damning as these entries were, it was what they revealed about Aaron's motive that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Up until this point, detectives believed the crime had been fueled by jealousy and a toxic relationship. But as they dug deeper into Aaron's life, a far more disturbing truth began to surface. Aaron hadn't just been a possessive boyfriend, he had been living a double life. Financial records and witness testimonies uncovered a web of illegal activity stretching back several years. Aaron had been involved in a small but lucrative drug distribution network operating out of their quiet Texas town. He kept this side of his life hidden from almost everyone, including Lena. That is, until the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Friends of Lena came forward with new statements, recalling conversations in which Lena seemed worried, even scared. She had mentioned seeing something she wasn't supposed to see. At the time, no one understood what she meant. Now it was clear. Lena had stumbled upon evidence of Aaron's illegal dealings. Perhaps she'd overheard a phone call or discovered something hidden in his truck or apartment. Whatever it was enough for her to confront him. According to her friends, Lena had been planning to leave town for Dallas to pursue her nursing dreams. But before she left, she intended to go to the police with what she knew. For Aaron, that was a threat he couldn't allow. Detectives pieced together a terrifying narrative. Aaron realized that if Lena exposed him, not only would his secret life be destroyed, but the entire operation he was tied to would collapse. Facing the possibility of prison and the loss of everything he'd built, Aaron made a choice, a cold, calculated decision to silence the one person who could bring him down. The final pages of the notebook confirmed their worst fears. Aaron had written detailed plans for the night of September 14, 2004. He described luring Lena to the creek under the pretense of reconciling after their recent argument. He even noted the specific route he would take to avoid being seen, and how he planned to dispose of any evidence that could link him to the crime. But what chilled investigators most was the entry that read, "If it comes to it, I'll do what needs to be done." Those 7 words left no doubt about his intentions. With this new information, the prosecution's case became ironclad. When Aaron's trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, townspeople, and members of Lena's family. Harold and Margaret sat in the front row, their faces etched with years of grief and determination. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. They laid out the timeline of events with precision: the duct tape with Lena's blood, the cell phone records placing Aaron at the scene, the threatening messages, and now the damning contents of the notebook. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends described the changes they saw in Aaron's behavior before Lena vanished. Former associates testified about his involvement in illegal activities, painting a picture of a man who would stop at nothing to protect himself. But the most emotional testimony came from Lena's own family. When Margaret took the stand, her voice trembled as she recounted the night her daughter went missing, the unanswered calls, the frantic search, the moment she saw Lena's abandoned truck by the creek. Harold, though stoic, broke down when shown a photo of Lena taken just days before her disappearance. The defense tried to paint Aaron as a heartbroken young man caught up in circumstantial evidence. They argued that the DNA on the duct tape could have been transferred accidentally, that the cell phone records only proved he was nearby, not that he harmed Lena. But when the notebook was entered into evidence, their arguments crumbled. Each chilling entry was read aloud, one after another, as the jury sat in stunned silence. The words spoke for themselves, leaving no room for doubt about Aaron's intentions. During closing arguments, the prosecutor's voice rang with emotion. Lena Whitcomb was a young woman with dreams, with a future. She trusted Aaron Kellerman, and he betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of passion. This was a carefully planned, deliberate act of murder. When it came time for the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Harold gripped Margaret's hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The foreman stood and read the words the family had waited 20 years to hear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Aaron Kellerman, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps and sobs filled the room. Margaret buried her face in Harold's shoulder as tears streamed down her cheeks. After 2 decades of pain and unanswered questions, justice had finally been served. Aaron's expression remained blank as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, Harold looked directly at him. In a quiet but firm voice, he said, "You took our daughter from us, but you will never take her memory." For the Whitcomb family, the verdict brought closure, but it also left them grappling with a painful truth. Lena's life had been stolen not only by someone she loved, but by a man driven by greed, fear, and a desperate need to keep his dark secrets hidden. The discovery of the notebook had given them answers, but it also revealed just how deeply Aaron's deception ran. In the end, Lena's story became a testament to perseverance, the unyielding fight of a family who refused to give up, and the determination of investigators who refused to let a cold case remain cold forever. And as the courtroom emptied and the lights dimmed, one thing became clear. Even in the darkest corners of small-town Texas, the truth will always find its way to the surface. Just days after the verdict was read, and the Whitcomb family finally felt the weight of 2 decades begin to lift, an unexpected discovery sent shockwaves through the community once again. For Harold and Margaret, it felt like living through a second nightmare, a cruel twist of fate that proved Lena's story was not as simple as they had believed. Detective Emily Vargas was back at her desk, still catching up on a mountain of post-trial paperwork, when she received a call from the Forensic Evidence Lab. At first, she assumed it was routine, a follow-up about the case file or a misplaced document. But the tone of the technician's voice immediately told her this was something far more serious. During a secondary review of items collected from the creek area years earlier, a new test had been run using the most advanced DNA extraction methods available. This test had been unavailable even just a few months ago, but the lab decided to reprocess certain items to ensure nothing had been overlooked. One of those items was a fragment of rope that had been dismissed early in the investigation as unrelated to the crime. This time, the results were different. The rope didn't just contain Aaron's DNA, it contained the DNA of another individual, a person who, to Vargas's astonishment, was someone deeply connected to the Whitcomb family. The match came back to Robert "Bobby" Gaines, a longtime family friend and neighbor. Bobby wasn't just anyone. He had been close to Lena since she was a child. He'd attended every one of her school plays, family barbecues, and community events. He was the man Harold had trusted to help fix their fence, the man who had brought casseroles to their home during the early days of Lena's disappearance. Bobby had been there through every search party, every vigil, standing by Margaret's side as she lit candles for her daughter. He had wept with them, prayed with them, and promised he would never stop fighting for justice. And now, evidence placed him at the scene of Lena's death. Detective Vargas felt a wave of nausea as the realization sank in. This wasn't just about Aaron anymore. Someone who had gained the Whitcomb family's deepest trust had been involved all along. Vargas knew she had to move carefully. If Bobby truly had been part of the cover-up, there was no telling how far he would go to keep his secret buried. She quietly assembled a small team and began digging into Bobby's past. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Bank records revealed that in the weeks following Lena's disappearance, Bobby's account had several large, unexplained deposits. They were spaced out just enough to avoid suspicion, but when compared to Aaron's withdrawal records, the pattern became clear. Aaron had been paying Bobby for his silence. Phone records added another damning layer. On the night of September 14, 2004, the night Lena vanished, Bobby's cell phone pinged off a tower less than a mile from the creek. He had always claimed he was home asleep that night, a claim that until now had never been questioned. As Vargas pieced the puzzle together, a horrifying truth emerged. Aaron hadn't acted alone. Bobby had been there that night. It became clear that Bobby's role had been crucial. According to the evidence, Aaron had lured Lena to the creek and carried out the initial attack. But when things spiraled out of control, Bobby helped him cover it up. He had assisted in moving evidence, cleaning the scene, and ensuring that Lena's body was never found. His local knowledge of the rural landscape had allowed them to hide what happened for nearly 2 decades. The most gut-wrenching part was that Bobby had spent those very same years comforting Harold and Margaret, all while knowing the truth. When Vargas finally confronted Bobby, he initially laughed off the accusations, calling them absurd. But when shown the DNA results, his bravado cracked. His hands began to tremble, and his breathing grew shallow. After hours of intense questioning, Bobby finally broke. Through tears, he admitted that Aaron had come to him in a panic that night, claiming Lena had threatened to expose his illegal activities. Aaron begged Bobby to help him, insisting it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. Bobby claimed he agreed because he feared what Aaron's associates might do if the truth got out. He swore he never wanted to be involved, but once he helped move the body and clean the scene, there was no turning back. What made Bobby's confession even more disturbing was what came next. According to him, Lena's body was never placed where investigators had searched for years. Instead, Aaron and Bobby had hidden her remains in an abandoned well on a private piece of farmland owned by one of Bobby's relatives. The location was so remote and concealed that search teams had unknowingly passed within yards of it countless times without realizing. Vargas immediately dispatched a search crew to the site. When they arrived, they found the well exactly where Bobby described. Using specialized equipment, they carefully descended into its depths. There, beneath layers of dirt and debris, they discovered skeletal remains along with a few personal belongings, including Lena's necklace, which Margaret had given her as a graduation gift. The sight of it left the entire team silent. After 20 long years, Lena had finally been found. When Harold and Margaret were notified, they collapsed into each other's arms, overcome with grief and relief all at once. The pain of knowing Lena was truly gone was indescribable, but at least now they could lay her to rest. Bobby was immediately arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and desecration of human remains. His betrayal sent ripples through the community. Neighbors who had once embraced him now looked at him with disgust. Families who had trusted him to watch their children couldn't fathom how he had been capable of such a monstrous act. The Whitcombs were shattered. Harold in particular struggled to process that the man he had once considered a brother had been standing by his side at every search, every vigil, every courtroom hearing, all while knowing exactly what had happened to his daughter. At Bobby's arraignment, Harold stood silently as Bobby was led into the courtroom in shackles. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Harold's face was unreadable, but Bobby broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, as he was escorted to the defendant's table. During the brief proceeding, Bobby's lawyer entered a plea of guilty, hoping for leniency in exchange for his cooperation. In his statement, Bobby said, "I can never undo what I've done. I was weak, I was scared, but most of all, I was wrong." The judge, unmoved, denied bail. For Detective Vargas, the revelation was bittersweet. She had solved the final piece of the puzzle, but the cost was unimaginable. This case had proven that evil wasn't always a stranger lurking in the shadows. It could wear the face of someone you thought you knew. When the news broke, the entire town was rocked. It was one thing to believe a jealous boyfriend had committed a horrific crime. It was another to realize that a trusted member of the community had helped cover it up for 2 decades. At Lena's memorial service, held just weeks later, hundreds of people gathered to honor her memory. Margaret placed Lena's necklace atop the casket, whispering a final goodbye to her daughter. As the sun set over the Texas hills, Harold stood before the crowd and spoke with a trembling voice. "For 20 years we lived in darkness," he said. "But Lena's light never went out. Today we bring her home. Today we let her rest." The crowd fell silent as Harold and Margaret laid Lena to rest, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and law enforcement officers who had fought tirelessly for justice. In the end, the truth had come out. Aaron was serving life without parole, and Bobby would likely spend the rest of his days behind bars. But for the Whitcomb family, True justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about finally knowing what happened, about having answers to the questions that had haunted them for 2 decades. And while their hearts would never fully heal, they could finally close this chapter and begin to rebuild their lives. As Detective Vargas looked out over the crowd, she reflected on the lesson this case had taught her. Trust is fragile, and sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted by those closest to us. For Harold and Margaret Whitcomb, the nightmare was over. But the memory of their daughter and the betrayal they endured would remain etched in their hearts forever. As the final chapter of Lena Whitcomb's story closed, the small Texas town that had been haunted by her disappearance for 2 long decades began to heal, piece by piece. For years, her name had been whispered in grocery store aisles, discussed in hushed tones at church gatherings, and etched into homemade flyers taped to telephone poles that slowly faded under the relentless Texas sun. Now, with the truth revealed and Lena's remains finally laid to rest, the community faced a new reality, one where the mystery was no longer unsolved, but the scars it left behind would remain forever. In the weeks following Bobby Gaines's arrest, there was a visible shift in the town's atmosphere. The once close-knit community struggled to reconcile the image of a trusted neighbor with the horrifying betrayal he had committed. Parents found themselves rethinking who they allowed into their children's lives. Friends second-guessed conversations and relationships they had taken for granted. The ripple effect of deceit was far-reaching, touching nearly every household. But alongside the pain, there was also a profound sense of unity. The Whitcomb family, despite their unimaginable grief, became a source of inspiration. Harold and Margaret chose to channel their sorrow into action, determined to prevent other families from enduring what they had endured. Together, they founded the Lena Whitcomb Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for advancements in forensic technology. The foundation quickly gained momentum, attracting support from neighboring towns and even across the state. Harold often spoke at local schools, urging young people to be vigilant and to speak up when they saw something wrong. Margaret, though quieter, poured her energy into counseling other grieving parents, offering them the compassion and understanding only someone who had walked in their shoes could provide. As word of Lena's story spread, it began to symbolize something larger than one family's tragedy. It became a testament to perseverance, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of community. Local leaders came together to honor Lena's memory in a tangible way. Near the very creek where her abandoned truck had been discovered all those years ago, a memorial was built. It wasn't elaborate or flashy, but it was deeply meaningful. A simple stone monument bore Lena's name, her birth and death years, and a single inscription: "Her light lives on." Around the monument, a small garden was planted, filled with wildflowers native to Texas, Lena's favorite. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, townspeople gathered at the memorial for a candlelight vigil. Neighbors who had once been divided by suspicion now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the shared hope that no family would ever again face 20 years of unanswered questions. The memorial became more than a symbol of Lena's life. It became a promise, a vow that the mistakes made in her investigation would never be repeated. Local law enforcement began implementing new protocols for missing persons cases, ensuring that no detail, no matter how small, would ever be overlooked again. For Detective Emily Vargas, the case left an indelible mark. She often returned to the memorial alone, standing silently by the creek as the wind rustled through the wildflowers. Solving Lena's case had been the defining moment of her career, but it had also taught her a painful truth. Sometimes justice arrives late, and sometimes it costs more than anyone could have imagined. In interviews, Vargas often spoke about the lessons she learned. "This case showed us the importance of persistence," she said. "It showed us that even when a trail goes cold, there's always hope. And it reminded us that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones hiding the darkest truths." The Whitcomb family's story also sparked broader change. State officials cited Lena's case as a driving force behind the expansion of Texas's Cold Case Task Force, which received increased funding and resources to prevent other families from suffering in silence for decades. Lena's name was frequently invoked during legislative sessions, a constant reminder of why these reforms mattered. Nationally, true crime enthusiasts, advocacy groups, and media outlets shared Lena's story, turning her case into a symbol of hope for families across the country. Many reached out to Harold and Margaret, thanking them for their courage and drawing strength from their journey. Yet for Harold and Margaret, the most meaningful impact was deeply personal. They found solace in knowing that Lena's life, though tragically cut short, continued to touch others. Through the foundation, the memorial, and the changes it inspired, Lena's legacy was one of light rather than darkness. On the first anniversary of Lena's funeral, the family gathered at the memorial for a private moment of reflection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Harold knelt beside the monument, his hand resting on the cool stone. With tears in his eyes, he whispered, "We found you, Lena. We brought you home." Margaret, standing beside him, placed a single wildflower at the base of the stone and added softly, "And now, your story will help others find their way home too." For the community, Lena's case became a reminder that even the darkest secrets eventually come to light. It was proof that no matter how much time had passed, the truth had a way of surfacing. And while justice couldn't bring Lena back, it could offer peace to those left behind. As the years passed, the garden around Lena's memorial flourished, a living symbol of renewal and hope. Children who had once seen the area as a place of fear now ran and played nearby, their laughter mingling with the sound of the creek. Life, though forever changed, moved forward. The memory of Lena Whitcomb remained woven into the fabric of the town. Her story was told and retold, not just as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to resilience, love, and the unyielding power of truth. And for Harold and Margaret, though the ache of loss never truly faded, they found comfort in knowing that their daughter's light would never be extinguished. Through every vigil, every flower planted, every family helped by their foundation, Lena's presence endured, a guiding beacon for those still searching in the darkness. What do you think really happened on that September night in 2004, when Lena Whitcomb vanished without a trace? Was it truly just a crime of passion, a desperate act by someone she trusted, or was there more to this story than what we've uncovered so far? Could there have been warning signs in the days or even hours leading up to her disappearance, subtle clues that, if recognized, might have changed everything? These are the questions that still haunt this small Texas town and the people who knew and loved Lena. Think about it for a moment. A young woman with her entire future ahead of her, taken in the blink of an eye. A family torn apart, forced to endure 20 agonizing years of uncertainty and grief. And an entire community left to grapple with the fact that the person responsible had been walking among them all along, hiding behind a mask of normalcy. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was it a failure of law enforcement, a lack of resources, or simply the perfect storm of deception and circumstance that allowed this case to grow cold for so many years? There are no easy answers, but your perspective matters. We want to hear what you think. Share your thoughts, theories, and reflections in the comments below. What do you believe really happened that night? Do you think Aaron Kellerman was the sole mastermind behind Lena's murder, or do you believe others played a role that has yet to be revealed? These conversations are more than just speculation. They keep the memory of Lena alive and ensure that her story continues to be told. They also shine a light on the cracks in our system, the missed opportunities, the investigative blind spots, and the moments when justice faltered. Because when we speak up, when we demand answers, we honor not only Lena's life, but also the lives of countless others whose stories remain unresolved. If this story moved you, if you felt the heartbreak of Lena's family as they searched for her, if you shared in their anger when the investigation stalled, and if you celebrated their bittersweet victory when the truth finally emerged, please take a moment to like this video. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it helps spread awareness and brings attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you real-life mysteries, heartbreaking true crime stories, and powerful narratives of resilience and justice. These aren't just stories on a screen. They're the lived experiences of real people, and by engaging with them, you help ensure that these victims are never forgotten. Lena's case is a reminder that even the deepest secrets will eventually surface. It's proof that a family's love and determination can move mountains, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Her parents' fight for justice, the tireless work of investigators, and the eventual breakthrough that exposed the truth show us that while justice may be delayed, it is never completely out of reach. But Lena's story also serves as a warning. It reminds us to pay attention to those around us, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to never underestimate the lengths people will go to hide their darkest deeds. And if you thought this case was shocking, if you were stunned by the betrayal, the cover-up, and the final twist that revealed someone close to the Whitcomb family had been involved all along, just wait until you see what's coming next. Next week, we'll bring you a case that defies belief, a story of lies, manipulation, and an ending so disturbing that it will stay with you long after the video ends. It's a mystery that will test everything you think you know about human nature and justice. So, stay with us, because in the world of true crime, there's always another secret waiting to be uncovered, another truth fighting to come to light, and another story that must be told. Lena Whitcomb's legacy lives on, and by being here, by listening, by sharing, by refusing to look away, you become part of that legacy. Together, we can honor her memory and continue the fight for justice, one story at a time.